You're listening to the TEPIS Paranormal Talking Point podcast, a show that discusses various aspects of the paranormal world, with paranormal news, ghost stories, interviews, and much more. And without further ado, let's get into some talking points. Hi guys, Scott here from TEPIS Paranormal, and welcome back to another episode of the TEPIS Paranormal Talking Point podcast. So today I'm joined by Professor Jeff Meldrum. Jeff is a professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University. Jeff's also considered an expert in the Sasquatch or Bigfoot. I had a chance to sit down with Jeff and we talked about a number of different things, ranging from the various types of Bigfoot-like creatures around the world, where Bigfoot's hiding in North America, as well as discussing a number of famous Bigfoot cases. So sit back and enjoy the interview. So thank you, Jeff, for joining me.
My pleasure.
So, if you wouldn't mind, if you could sort of introduce yourself a little bit.
Sure. My name's Jeff Meldrum. I'm a professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University, where I teach human gross anatomy in the health professions programs and research the evolution of human bipedalism. And as a result of that, especially the functional morphology of the foot and the fossil record of that set of adaptations, that's what brought me into an involvement with the question of other relic hominoids, and especially the footprint evidence, where my attention, my professional expertise has been applied most focusedly.
Perfect. So I've read online from a few other interviews you've done that obviously you weren't always a believer in Bigfoot, that sort of thing, and then at some point that obviously changed.
Well, I don't like the label of believer, because as a scientist, and I know it's not intended in a pejorative way, but as a scientist, belief has really nothing to do with it. It's all about how convincing, how compelling is the evidence, short of a conclusive proof. And oftentimes, what I call ideological skeptics use the moniker "true believer" as a derogatory term. And to your common, to your man or woman on the street, the term belief typically has a connotation of faith, an acceptance or conviction held essentially in the absence of conclusive evidence. Now, sure, we're a little bit short of conclusive evidence, but I'm convinced on the basis of the evidence. So I've always been intrigued. I mean, since I was first introduced to this topic as a youngster, clear back in 1968 when Patterson was publicly showing his film, it intrigued me. I must admit, as I became, or I was periodically exposed to it later in my academic career, enough time had transpired, and I'd not kept a pace of the developments, the scientific developments. And it seemed that if, as so many assume, if there really was something to this, something would have been resolved by now. And so I did enter in somewhat skeptical. I mean, I was objective, I believe, though, not cynical about the topic. And as my familiarity with the evidence, and especially being able to evaluate the footprint evidence from a position of expertise now, I had a very different perception of what this was, and the substance of the question and its implications, the implications of the answer to that question. So, and it's been an interesting. I mean, even that position has evolved tremendously over the past 20 plus years that I've been involved with this. I like to say now, it's really true that now I think science is finally just kind of caught up and converging with the some of the fundamental propositions, allegations, assertions of this very intriguing question. When I first became involved, there was a lot about it that seemed very counterintuitive, very contradictory to the conventional wisdom of anthropology of that time, and that has changed dramatically. There's been a very significant paradigm shift in anthropology and our perception of the pattern and process of human evolution, and now the prospect of the possible existence of relic hominoid species is very plausible, and in fact very probable, given the recent turn of events with the proliferation of discovered species and the recognition of a much more diverse bushy phylogenetic tree. So
Okay, so obviously during that you mentioned the Patterson Gilman film. I think I guess that's one of the most well-known pieces of Bigfoot media, Bigfoot evidence. What are your thoughts on that film?
Oh, I've looked at that film in so many different ways and so many times. I'm as convinced as I could be, short of having stood there on the sandbar at the time, that it is the real McCoy, the real deal. If I only had the footprints associated with that event, I would be convinced of the credibility. But to have not only this very well documented set of footprints, the ones that Roger cast and the ones that Bob Titmus cast, and even a couple others that have surfaced over the years, but to actually have the film of the track maker. So, I can infer functional morphology based on the signatures, the dynamic signatures evident in the footprints, evident to my eye and to others who are so informed. But then to have that inference confirmed by the actual movements, the actual kinematics and dynamics of the step of the figure in the film, just absolutely corroborates, confirms those interpretations. So it has stood up under repeated scrutiny as new technologies have been applied to its analysis. It emerges even more intriguing, more consistent. It anticipated, but again, we were talking about science catching up. The film presents a number of odd combinations of traits that in 1967 literally against the grain of conventional wisdom in anthropology. And that was the reason for the sort of knee-jerk rejection by the experts, is they couldn't accommodate it. There was no context, no cubbyhole that would accommodate another bipedal species in addition to Homo sapiens. And now, some 50 plus years later, those at the time odd combinations are exactly the mosaic combination of features that we now recognize for early bipedal hominins. And so it's amazing. You might give Roger the benefit of one lucky guess, or whoever was coaching him. He certainly couldn't have contrived it on his own. Even if it was a legitimate, realistic possibility that it was a hoax, that it was just a man in a fursuit. But how could he get a half a dozen different combinations of unique traits right on the nose, So that to me, is a very compelling, very persuasive way to consider the evidence of that film.
And I think, like you say, I guess it's a number of traits that at the time weren't things that people knew to hoax and to fake to make it convincing. It's things that I guess have been discovered since that are now, scientific fact.
Yep, absolutely. One of my favorites is John Napier, a well-known primatologist, British primatologist at the Yerkes, at the Smithsonian, and he was actually on the panel that viewed the film. He was apparently impressed by this proposition, by the evidence sufficiently, that he in his golden years wrote one of the first scientific treatments, first scientific monographs on it, and in that he came down rather negatively on the Patterson Gilman film, but he was forthright enough to acknowledge he really couldn't put his finger on a rationale to justify that opinion. And he said, other than when I look at what's depicted there, from the waist up, it looks essentially like an ape, but from the waist down, it has the limb proportions of a human. He said it was nearly impossible to conceive of such a mosaic, such a hybrid existing in nature. So it must be contrived. Well, isn't it interesting? His book came out in 72, I think it was. By the next several years, we had the announcement of Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis. And for the first time, we had representation of this very early bipedal hominin species that included associated crania and postcrania, namely specifically the pelvis, the knees, and parts of the ankle, and so forth. And how did they describe it in the popular press releases? Isn't this interesting? From the waist up, she looks essentially like a chimpanzee. From the waist down, she looks like a hairy human. I mean, that was the linchpin in Napier's argument to reject the validity of the film. And yet, just a few years later, it's acknowledged as the pattern for early bipedal hominins, of which it's not unexpected or shouldn't be a surprise that the subject of that film would emulate in many ways. In fact, if we wanted to have a picture of what a robust Australopithecine might look like, and we didn't have the associated stigma, the notoriety of that Patterson Gilman film frame, that famous frame, we could lift that and stick it in an introductory text in Anthropology to illustrate the conception of what the appearance of a robust Australopithecine, and it would be spot on. In fact, I have a slide I use in one of my presentations where I have an illustration by J. Matterness, who's a famous anthropological illustrator, showing an encounter between a band of robust Australopithecines and Homo habilis wielding their little pebble tools, and it looks just like a group of Sasquatch there, only on a slightly smaller scale, but it is remarkably convergent, remarkably parallel.
Okay. So one thing that I'm curious about, and this is something that I don't think there's going to be there's not going to be a definitive answer to. What do you think are the sort of numbers for Sasquatch worldwide?
Worldwide, well, first let me dispel a common misconception that all reports of wild men of one form or another are equivalent to Sasquatch, just different iterations of Sasquatch. There are, as I mentioned, we now perceive the pattern of human and hominid rather, the apes evolution as being a bushy tree with numerous branches. So at any given time in the past, there's potentially a number of sympatric, or at least contemporaneous species. So not all of these reports are of Sasquatch type creatures. I think it's interesting. There is a lot of merit, I think, to be placed on Ivan Sanderson's thesis in his very pioneering book, an encyclopedic book, where he's considering this question. He calls them ABSMs, abominable snowmen, in a generic sense. But he ends up with 4 types. And it's very easy to align many of the accounts of these 4 different types. So, but having said that, now there is certainly good evidence of kind of a circum-Pacific distribution, at least, of these large-bodied bipedal, either early hominin or ape, hominoid, with distribution extending perhaps as far west as the Caucasus Mountains. There's evidence of Sasquatch-like encounters and footprints to corroborate those. So, but restricting our discussion for just a moment here to North America, given that they are or would be a large-bodied ape or hominin, I mean, splitting hairs as to which side of the fence we're straddling there at this point, because we're pretty close to that divergence, that area. The natural history would suggest that they are long-lived, slow or infrequently reproducing, slow developing. And so populations like that emphasize a K selection strategy have much fewer numbers. They're a top predator, or at least the top of their food chain. They're omnivore. And so and given the rarity of encounters and even rarer corroboration of such reports by trace or physical evidence, they have to be very few in number. So without belaboring, I'm not just snatching these numbers out of the air, but by taking lots of clues about their behavior, their social structure, probably solitary, so forth and so forth, looking at examples of repeat appearances of individuals who are recognizable based on their footprint record. So we have some sense of a range, and possibly even a little insight into longevity when you have an adult footprint that spans, that in its appearance and discovery spans about 2 decades or more as an adult. That says they probably lived to be at least 40-50 years, I would guess. If these creatures, this species is nested within the great apes and humans, the life expectancy is pretty consistent throughout. So that range of 45 to 60 years, probably pretty good. So it doesn't take a lot of numbers to replenish. Given that, possible social structure of semi-solitary social structure, a large home range in a temperate forest where resources are more scattered, more patchy in their distribution, I would put the estimate in North America somewhere between maybe 2,000 and 3,000. If you look just at my home state of Idaho, if I look at all the available habitat, I look at the distribution of other animals based on the productivity of the habitat, like black bear. There's been a published paper that demonstrates a fairly remarkable congruence between bioclimatic factors that seem to determine black bear habitat and where Bigfoot is reported. Not surprising, since they both have omnivorous diet, have probably similar requirements for cover and so forth. But to help you appreciate the rarity for Idaho, I come up with a number which plugs in very nicely with that overall number of about 150 to maybe 250, which sounds, on one hand, it sounds like a lot, but then when you realize that in Idaho, in my state, there is an estimated population of black bear of 35,000. So 150 to 250 versus 35,000. And you think about how infrequently you bump into black bear when you're out in the wild, how infrequently you find a black bear skeleton, in the wild. And so then it starts to put into perspective, I think, a lot of these questions and challenges that are raised.
With that again, so obviously the nesting of Sasquatches, a lot of, or I believe all of the great apes obviously nest. They set up their own nests, and Sasquatch nests are fairly, I don't want to say common, but they're one of the people, when people go out looking specifically for Sasquatches, they're one of the things that people look for. What are your sort of thoughts on the nesting for Sasquatches? Because obviously the nests have to be quite large, and they have, I guess they're sort of made of things from nearby areas and,
Hmm.
trees, that sort of thing. And you see a lot of fallen trees or trees at awkward angles that they wouldn't naturally fall at, which a lot of people
Hmm.
attribute to Sasquatch.
Right.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, in some of the early literature, there were references or mentions of the possibility of nests. There was also debate about whether what was being observed was something attributable to Sasquatch or just a bear bed, as they were called, where bears will also scrape together detritus and litter to create an insulative layer. Basically, they're sleeping on something that separates them from the cold ground that's going to be a heat sink and draw away body temperature. Um, but not a lot of not a lot of otherwise protection. They're fairly exposed to the elements. There have been similar things, like I said, attributed to Sasquatch, which exhibit more manipulative behaviors that we also see evidence of in, as you point out, the great apes, which either make tree nests where they're up in the boughs, bending the boughs in and folding them, plating them, and laying on top of them to create a springy bed, a hammock almost like, versus the larger bodied, say the male gorillas that just simply pull material up and create a pad on the ground. Um, with Sasquatch, there have been eyewitness anecdotes that suggest that they sleep out in the open, that they just sleep on the ground, as many animals do, deer or rabbits or whatever. They don't always have a den. They don't always have a secluded, sheltered area, but will just sometimes bed down in a hollow or a low spot. They obviously will scrape away some of the unevenness of the leaf litter or forest litter, pine cones and twigs and so forth. Now, some uh, uh, renewed or increased attention has been directed to this question with the discovery in the Olympic Peninsula of Washington of some nests that were attributed to Sasquatch behavior. These are not found on a regular basis, and again, though, it's not like a troop of gorillas making a nightly set of nests on the ground, but we're typically talking about solitary individuals. I would assert. In this case, however, when these nests were found, there was quite a number of them. There, in excess of five nests, not of extraordinary size, but big enough that it certainly could accommodate a 6 to 8 foot Sasquatch in a fetal position, uh, uh, resting on this. What was interesting was they were not like your typical bear bed, in that there had been, green boughs that had been kind of laid down in a springy lattice, then forest material piled on top, and then what was most distinctive was this particular location where this was first discovered, was behind a very extensive hedgerow of evergreen blueberries, which there in that particular region grow to a height of 7 or 8 feet. And the top foot and a half of the green spriggers on the end there had been systematically nipped off, and all of these not just simply piled, but it looked as if the stem end was shoved into the detritus, and then basically they were sort of plated, not unlike a gorilla nest, to provide a little more springiness and a little more contour, a rim, with the superficial resemblance to a bird nest. That was very atypical, and we confirmed this by when I was finally invited to come and visit the site. One of the things we did, in addition to taking samples of the detritus and so forth to have it tested for DNA, we used heavy shears to cut a pie-shaped wedge into this rather circular nest. and all that material was carefully lifted out and put it bagged up and taken back and dried and spread out and carefully examined under a microscope to identify any fibers. And there were hair found that did in fact appear to be a non-human primate based on the overall anatomy, but unfortunately no DNA from the hair. However, from the soil sample, the DNA test, the environmental DNA protocols that were applied to that produced one primate which was identified as human. Now, so certainly there's the potential for contamination because there were eyewitnesses there were the investigators on the scene, and we're constantly shedding dander and so forth and skin flakes, so on. Even though care had been taken to keep people away from this particular nest that the samples were eventually taken from. But my argument, I mean, that's one possibility. The second is that there wasn't sufficient DNA sampled, sequence that is, in order to differentiate two very closely related species.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, we could be, if this creature is a hominin, it would be much more closely related to us than any other living great ape out there. And the figures that are offered in the literature for identity between, say, chimp and gorilla, our closest ally amongst the hominoids,
mm-hmm.
range from 96 to 98% identity. So this creature could be 99, 99.5. I mean, we could be talking about a 0.5%, a 0.25% difference. And so unless you sequence not only, I think, a representative mitochondrial samples, but include the nuclear genome as well, I think there's a real possibility that many of these very superficial, very preliminary analyses have just produced a human result, because we're simply looking at segments of the DNA that are essentially indistinguishable from our own.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where we're at. I don't think that the construction of these types of nests is a universal behavior and a constant or consistently routine nightly behavior.
Mm-hmm.
I suspect that this was kind of an unusual set of circumstance, given the number of nests, if they were occupied by different individuals, and we have no way of really knowing that.
Of course, yeah.
But one of the things that kind of piqued my imagination was that amongst this cluster of nests was one that was poised in the crotch of a little bush right there, up about 2 feet off the ground, and it was a smaller nest that was only about 1.5 feet, 2 feet in diameter. And when I saw it, the first thought was, this looked like a bassinet, or as you might see over there, a pram.
Yeah.
And so then the thought occurred to me: could this assemblage have been the result of a female giving birth? And the aunties were there to lend support. Maybe a male was there to protect the group
mm-hmm.
within its territory. Who knows? But it's intriguing to kind of see that the investigative group has subsequently prospected other similar physical settings in the region, and have found the remains of much older nests that have subsequently deteriorated down into the ground, basically, but evidence that this is a periodic. But obviously they didn't come back to this particular site for over 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
So
okay,
it's interesting. Yeah.
So the one thing, obviously, you sort of mentioned it earlier, the skeletal remains of these creatures. What are your thoughts on sort of why so few of them are found, and why? I think, like you said earlier, there's a very small number. So that's
Yeah,
obviously one thing. But what are your
exactly.
thoughts on those in general?
Yeah, well, that's a good point to mention up front and sort of have in mind as a backdrop, and that is the common denominator of low population numbers, and as we also mentioned, long life expectancy, relatively long life expectancy, no natural enemies in the wild, uh, at least for adults. And so if they survive infancy, then a death is going to be a fairly rare event. So say, take the example of uh, my description of my home state of Idaho here in the northern Rocky Mountains. We have probably more roadless wilderness than any of the other 48 states. So if you've got 150 to 200 Sasquatch, how many of those are geriatric? How many are in their golden years on the verge of expiring? And so you narrow that down and think, it's not beyond the realm of reasonable possibility that a death might occur, one death maybe in a year or in 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so you think about that in context of the remark about finding bear skeletal remains. My predecessor, Dr. Krantz, used to, as he describes in his book, would routinely ask audiences how many have ever seen a skeleton or a skull of a bear that died a natural death or that wasn't hit by a car or shot by a hunter. Mm-hmm. And in some 20 plus years of asking that, he never had a single person volunteer that they had. I don't ask it religiously. I don't even ask it regularly. But when this question comes up, I then ask the audience. And in that time, I've had 2 instances where individuals have found a bear skull in the wild. But they couldn't actually, say with certainty that it wasn't shot by a hunter or and expired or whatever, because they only found the skull and there was no complete skeleton. So there are the biological factors, the biotic factors, the factors of natural history of the species itself, the decomposers, the scavengers, and then there's also the abiotic, the physical environment. These creatures seem to prefer wet coniferous forests, which have notoriously acidic soils that are not conducive to the preservation of bone, unless that bone becomes deposited, say, in a limestone cave or in a riverine sedimentary environment. And so there are limestone caves to be found, and that's one interesting research angle is I have consulted with avocational and professional spelunkers, and if they have ever come across unusual animal bones. There are also investigators. There's a paleontologist from South Dakota who specializes in the excavation of Pleistocene deposits in limestone caves in the Alaskan Panhandle. Mm-hmm. And he'll go into a cave and they literally excavate the sediment all the way down to bedrock. And and they've done that on multiple caves. And I've asked him, how many bear remains have you found in those caves? And he said, oh, very few. He says you could probably count the numbers on your hand. The only time they ever find these, sometimes you'll see these spectacular photos of an entire articulated bear skeleton in a cave. Well, these are bears that have denned in the cave and have been trapped in there by a cave-in, and that has sealed the cave, and therefore their remains were left there undisturbed. Mm-hmm. But those are rare. I mean, in the hundreds of thousands of years that those could have occurred, there's only a few pictures you can find online, those exceptional cases of preservation. I actually, asked him. I was very, very forthright in my in introducing myself and my interest in talking to him about this question. And I simply asked him, I said, well, for a moment, assume that these creatures exist based on, your exposure, your knowledge of them. If that were the case, would it surprise you that you have not walked out of one of your caves with a giant primate molar?
Mm-hmm.
And he said, no, it doesn't surprise him at all, given the rarity. And the actual real life example, since we were talking about a circumpacific distribution, one possibility as a candidate, or at least as an analog, is Gigantopithecus, which we know as a species existed, had a 1.5 million year tenure as a species in East Asia. And yet for all that time, 1.5 million years, we've got two jaws and a few thousand isolated teeth. And we only have them because porcupines dragged those remains into these limestone caves, where they became preserved under those alkaline conditions. They all show the gnawing activities of the porcupines. Now, were there not limestone caves? Were there not porcupines or other rodents to concentrate those bones in the caves? We would have no idea of this 800-pound gorilla that lived in East Asia.
Yeah.
Now, Sasquatch may have only been in this continent a couple 100,000 years for all we know, depending on when the expansion of its range into the North American continent occurred. So it could be a fairly recent interloper, and the chances of finding one of those very rare preservation of a fossilized skeleton is, it's not unimaginable that we haven't found that golden ticket yet. That brass.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah.
So from the sort of worldwide pool of creatures and different things that fit under this sort of general bracket of Sasquatch-like creatures, do you have any outside of North America, any sort of particular sightings or any particular stories that are a favorite of yours?
Oh, sure. There, one of that I find really intriguing, and had a chance to look into it a little bit in person, is building on the work of Boris Porzhnev and Mary Jean Kaufman in the mountain ranges bordering Mongolia, the Tian Shan, Altai, Pamir ranges, and then down the Caucasus range, as I mentioned. I had the opportunity to visit the Caucasus and spend some time there, and these sightings, and particularly interesting. I mean, we weren't just barking up any old tree, but one of the things we were investigating, there had been a very a widely witnessed encounter with an impressive set of footprints, which measured about 16 inches long, which bore remarkable resemblance to any number of examples in my collection of Sasquatch tracks. In fact, we were able to replicate a right and a left that had been cast by a local naturalist who actually owned and ran a natural history museum in that village, that town, small town out in a rural town. But if I took those casts and intermingled them with my collection, you wouldn't be able to pick them out as distinct from the others. They're that similar, and it was quite intriguing to have. I brought along with me a little small 3-ring binder with a sampling of illustrations of some of the footprints and the casts, some of which illustrated a feature that has taken on a very central prominence in the description of the adaptation. The architecture of the Sasquatch foot is distinct from the human foot, which is a very flat, flexible foot that has sometimes leaves a very distinctive mid-tarsal pressure ridge because of the flexibility of the midfoot. And I had several illustrations depicting the examples of that and my interpretation of that. And this fellow, when he saw that, we were showing it to There was another gentleman who is a prominent citizen. He's actually on the state politician, but he is a very avid um, naturalist, and his daytime job is he's a professional guide and takes groups back into the mountains on nature tours,
Hmm.
eco tours. But so we had a chance to visit with him, and he was just getting one of his groups ready to take him up in the mountains, and we ran into him, and he's flipping through my 3-ring binder, and he saw that depiction of the mid-tarsal pressure ridge, and he immediately knew what it was, and had seen examples when this creature was walking up a steeper slope, and was transitioning onto the fore part of the foot and produced a pressure ridge. I was really impressed of that insight that he had already picked up on. But anyway, so so that's a Sasquatch-like tide. But you asked about the others. The other reason we were in the Caucasus is because there have been numerous reports of more man-like hairy wild men,
Hmm.
relic hominoids, and this region is within um, the inferred range of the Neanderthal, thought to be extinct. But yet here are these reports of creatures who, now in this case, leave footprints that are more human-sized, that do show an arch, but have a very robust, very splayed foot. But these creatures are described as being more human-sized, but still covered with hair, but more intelligent, not less animal-like, more human-like, in that they try to interact even with the locals. Um, there's the famous work of Myra Shackley, a British archaeologist who did her thesis work in this general region on Neanderthals, archaeological sites attributed to
Hmm.
Neanderthals, and they would actually collect these Mousterian spear points, these stereotypical stone tools of the Neanderthals. When shown to the local residents, they would look at them and say, "Oh yeah, the Almas make those, or the Almasti." They had different. The Almasti make those. Why are you interested in them? And that she would say, "Well, the Almasti. Who are the Almasti? Oh, they're these backward people, like kind of they sort of hillbillies as they
Yeah.
describe them. These backwards people that live up in the mountains. They're covered with hair. These wild people." And we trade with them once in a while, but pretty much we leave them alone. They leave us alone.
I
It
think.
was just a matter of fact that she was impressed with the consistency of the reports and description of this, that she actually went out on a significant professional limb and published, not only had a manuscript published in, I think it was an archaeology, Journal of Archaeology, but also published a monograph, a book. Uh, it's under a couple of different titles depending on which side of the pond you're on. Over here, it was Still Living, the Neanderthal, Sasquatch, and Yeti Enigma, or something like that.
Mhm.
Um, but she's no longer in academia, unfortunately. But it was an interesting contribution, and made a lot of the literature from due to as a result of her research, pursuing her doctorate. A lot of that literature and a lot of the foreign publications she made available to Anglophones, and very significant contribution.
Cool. So I think, like you say, one of the things that interests me with that is I know there's a large number of tribes in, South America and
Mhm.
generally across the globe that are completely separate from, um, from, I guess, modern civilization. And
Yes.
I guess it's completely plausible in a similar route that, in the same sort of way, these sort of tribes are less evolved and less advanced than some of the other modern civilization.
hmm Technologically and culturally, or well,
Hmm.
not culturally, I should say that, but technologically less advanced, but they are unquestionably modern Homo sapiens. And it's interesting, the fact that some of these have remained so elusive, uh, they are social. There are large groups of them. They live in villages. They have structures. They have villages and homes and so forth. And so you can imagine how much more elusive, how much more cryptic they would be if we were talking about single individuals that slept on the ground. That left that had no material culture, that left no archaeological record, no material evidence of their passing. So yeah, I think in each of these cases, I mean, take the Almasti for example. Many of the indigenous people say that there used to be, but they no longer exist. That they are extinct. They're gone. They don't have reports of them anymore, and so there's that very real possibility. The Yeti, if indeed there is an as yet unrecognized species of, and I think ape, the only suggestion of footprint evidence is very rare, and the only real convincing ones, because there's a lot of conflation with bear as well, some really silly conflation, but there's also a lot of ambiguity in fossils, in footprints that are attributed to the Yeti that are essentially unintelligible, from melting and sublimation. The spore is so distorted, you couldn't tell me what it is if your life depended on it. But of those couple of two or three, they clearly have a divergent big toe. It is a more ape-like foot. So the Yeti, if it exists, is probably a very rare population of ape that is has been sequestered in these high temperate forested valleys of the foothills of the Himalayas. The other one is very likely is the known by a number of names, the orang pendek, Idutu, or Ibugogo, Endutu, and so forth, that has gained more attention in subsequent to the discovery of Homo floresiensis, the hobbit. I mean, now suddenly we've got a fossil that is of a hominin, certainly not Homo. It was a real mistake and a misdirection to call it Homo, but it's almost certainly a late Australopithecine, maybe an early Homo habilis. Even there, splitting, I'm more of the camp that thinks we should move Homo to Homo ergaster and erectus, and that the previous are basically advanced Australopithecines. But I mean, splitting hairs, advanced Australopithecines or early Homo. It's like, what do you call it? So rose by any other name, but nevertheless, here we've got these creatures in Southeast Asia that may have persisted until just a few tens of thousands of years ago, if not to the present. And that's the funny thing, those who discovered the fossils and drew attention to their recent vintage also kind of sheepishly acknowledged, in a way, I guess, that's an unfair characterization, but did acknowledge publicly that, oh, and by the way, the locals have been telling us stories about these little hairy people that live up in the mountains all along.
Yeah.
So maybe they aren't gone, maybe they aren't altogether gone. And there's been some great research published recently. Dr. Gregory Forth from the University of Alberta just published a book for a more general audience, looking at the probability of connecting these dots. And he makes a very compelling case. So those are that. And then there's a few others kind of tossed in for good measure. There was recently a book that drew attention to reports of some sort of relic hominoid in South Africa. And and there are other stories. They don't get as much attention because Africa has its share of known relic hominoids, and they really are relics. These populations of chimpanzees and mountain and lowland gorillas and bonobos, they're in many instances, the mountain gorillas particularly are just hanging on by their fingernails,
Yeah.
and they are a relic population. But there's the possibility of based on eyewitness encounters of other fully bipedal, hominin-like creatures that are found in Africa. So there's a few others in various places that might be additional branches. Wouldn't be a surprise. I don't think it's a stretch. There was actually a time, when I was kind of reluctant to talk about or to bring up these other. I mean, it's one thing to to potentially be labeled as nuts because you're entertaining one creature, but then to suggest there's four or more. But actually, I think it's reinforcing because it lends substance to this much more acknowledged pattern of evolution, that there is this bushy tree and that you might expect differing branches in different geographical regions that represent various persistent lineages rather than just one, and certainly more than us.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So I think that brings us to the end of the questions I had there.
Okay.
Is there anything else you wanted to add?
Well, I just give a shameless plug for my publications. Obviously, a good handle, a good jumping off point for an understanding of the science behind the legend of Sasquatch is my book, Sasquatch Legend Meets Science. And it still is a very, even though it's now a little bit dated, 2006, it still is a very good and repletely illustrated introduction to this subject, with some meat on the bones for those. There's also, for more contemporary discussions of this subject, I edit an online journal, the Relic Hominoid Inquiry, myself as the managing editor, but we have a full-blown editorial board of PhDs and other appropriate professionals that provides a venue for discussion of scholarly works, reviews, commentaries, research articles, technical notes, and so forth. We're in our 12th year now, but it is the Relic Hominoid Inquiry, easy to Google, or it's isu.edu/RHI. And that's an excellent, also an excellent source of contemporary information.
Perfect. I'll put links to that in the description of the YouTube video for this interview. But yeah,
very good.
With that, I think that brings us to the end. So thank you so much for joining me, Jeff, and I'll catch you soon.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks. Once again, I'd like to give a big thank you to Jeff for joining me. If you want to check out any of Jeff's publications or want to know more about Jeff, you can find his social links in the description of the YouTube version of this podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode. It was a blast getting to talk to Jeff about Bigfoot. And that brings us to the end of this episode. I've been Scott from TEPIS Paranormal, and I'll see you soon.